So in my abstract, I say that my topic is what motivates fear of expertise. I don't stick strictly to that, but trusting experts is an act of humility, and it requires owning one's own limitations and vulnerability. And usually I think we're pretty good at knowing when we need help and seeking it, but sometimes denial of our vulnerability or our own limits gets in the way of turning to experts. This is probably something that has come up in many different talks. So enter that scenario, the predatory extremists, who market fear as a tool for profit and power. Extremists tend to mock and malign experts, ironically setting themselves up as experts on the far-right conspiracies that they trumpet. So how are ordinary people turned away from more accurate accounts of reality and into states of fear that lead them into self-destructive behaviors? Here, I think an epidemiology of toxic speech can help. And I'm grateful for this invitation because it has got me thinking about the connections between my work and many of the issues about trust. What we say, how we say it, when we are called upon to justify our claims, these are all patterned, governed by norms of discursive practice. Using some concepts from philosophy of language, plus some now more familiar concepts of epidemiology, which I really won't go into detail because of time, I address the way extremists use fear to redirect reason and to transfer trust away from actual experts. I hope that my discussion will give you food for thought in your projects. I'm only beginning to bring the issue of trust into my thinking about toxic speech and its power to shape social reality, and its power to disrupt what may have seemed like healthy situations and relationships and instill distrust. So we begin with a, I haven't shared my screen yet, sorry. I begin with a, here we go, share slide from Pierre Bourdieu, a quote. He reminds us, philosophers of language especially, that what speaks is not the utterance, the language, but the whole social person. Criticizing philosophers of language, this is what those who look for the illocutionary force of language in language forget. So this raises us to ask the question, who speaks, whose speaking counts, and on what grounds? And that's one of the places where the issue of trust comes into our discursive practices. So with expertise, just my background view about that guides the project in this talk is to look at when do you trust and when do you fear? And thinking about the medical case, which is the simplest, most direct case in some ways. Why do you avoid the doctor when you know you need care? And I think the obvious answer is that your need is a vulnerability. The doctor's knowledge is a power. Some people fear that power, and that fear can lead them to attack their own trust in the doctor's knowledge and skill. And on the other hand, so those are epistemic, but also character issues, their skill, motives, honesty, integrity, etc. Trust emphasizes competence, reliability, and honesty, which is a combination of both the epistemic and the moral or normative. So trust exists between agents. I trust my friends to tell me the truth. I rely on them in a variety of ways, but reliance isn't trust. Excuse me. So closing your mind to what you need is an issue with respect to facing your own vulnerabilities and facing the power of experts to help you or perhaps even harm you. So this is my teacher, Mcguire. I was in grad school when she wrote the trust papers, and she actually had to go to the University of Michigan for a leave in order to write them, because this is just an anecdote, but because she had so many history teaching requirements at Pitt that she wouldn't have had time to do that project. So Alan Gibbard set it up so she could go to Michigan, and she spent a semester and wrote those papers and got us all going. So she opens Trust and Antitrust with an epigraph from Cicely Bach: whatever matters to human beings, trust is the atmosphere in which it thrives. This is a great comment from Bach, and Bayer agrees with it and says, okay, but not all the things that thrive when there is trust between people and which matter are things that should be encouraged to thrive. Exploitation and conspiracy, as much as justice and fellowship, thrive better in an atmosphere of trust. There are immoral as well as moral trust relationships, and trust busting can be a morally proper goal. She says this very early on in the paper, and if you're familiar with the paper, you know that she works her way through some of this. So justice and fellowship on the one hand, exploitation, conspiracy on the other hand. I throw in echo chambers, a concept that was not around in Bayer's day, because echo chambers create patterns of trust and amongst their members and distrust for everyone else. So how do our discursive practices shape these? That's what I'm going to be talking about mostly today. How do our speech acts foster trust or distrust, and how do they build security? So I start, as I always do, with Wittgenstein on language games. And the reason this is important is because we need to see how intertwined our speech acts and are with broader social practices. So Wittgenstein says a language game is the whole consisting of the language and the actions into which it is woven. So we have both discursive and non-discursive elements to the game. The term language game, he adds later, is meant to bring into prominence the fact that the speaking of a language is part of an activity or form of life. And I put emphasis on speaking because it's an activity, right? So understanding Wittgenstein's analogy of language games, we need to make a few points. First, there are many kinds of games differentiated in a variety of ways without a common definition, but with overlapping traits that can be seen as what he calls family resemblances. What works in one game won't necessarily work in another. This is where Austin comes in, introducing the concept of Felicity Conditions. These will include actions within the game and actions and factors outside the game. So there are things that your social position will not allow you, there are speech acts that your social position may not allow you to actually achieve. And there's been some significant work on that. Most prominently, Ray Langton's 1993 paper, Speech Acts and Unspeakable Acts, but there are many, many varieties of this that we've been exploring ever since. Okay, so there's a crucial connection between speech acts and acts that are not speech. Keep Bourdieu's comment in mind that it's the whole social person who speaks. The telos of dominating speech is the lowering of others and elevating of some. So think of that concept of an echo chamber, which we'll come to later, but in the echo chamber, you raise the credibility of people who share your commitments, and you lower the credibility of people who do not. So a speech act takes place within a language game, which makes the speech act what it is. But the language game is only what it is as part of discursive practices, and those discursive practices are only what they are with respect to broader social practices. So think of these circles as being like cells with semi-permeable membranes. And also recognize that this is one set of circles, but in fact, if we mapped it out, it would be a really complex overlapping structure and very hard to see. So sometimes what happens when we miscommunicate or misplace our trust is that we're playing one game and the people we're dealing with are playing a different game. So in 1954, Wilfrid Sellars introduced a paper or published a paper called Some Reflections on Language Games, in which he doesn't completely respect what Wittgenstein said about structure. And he says, look, language games have these three elements. There's how you get into the game, there's what you do within the game, and then there's how you exit the game. This is really important for understanding the ways in which we generate trust or distrust with respect to language. So observation sentences are what Wilfrid Sellars was mainly concerned about in that paper. And that would be saying something like, oh, there's a bee or there's a flower. So I picked Low Husky because I'm at UConn and that's our mascot. And that's something that probably is not familiar to everyone in the audience. So if I say Low, as in behold, Husky, you're going to think I'm really strange. But if I did that walking across the UConn campus, people would look for either an actual husky dog or someone dressed up like one. And so when I do that, Low Husky, I am taking a position in the, UConn fan game or something like that. And it's pretty esoteric. Sometimes it's not so esoteric. And sometimes it's not so innocuous. Language entry moves get you into the game and move you from the world to words. Language moves are inside the game. And this is where Bob Brandam's work on inference licenses comes in. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. When you make these moves, people can challenge you and say, what are you doing? And you can defer your defense to someone who has licensed you. But these are all word moves. They're not completely innocent. Okay, I'll come back to that as well. The language exit moves. These are actions within the game that change permissions outside the game. So I call that action engendering. To go back to the doctor example, when you go to see the doctor, you say, doctor, I have this problem. And you describe, say I have this thing on my wrist. I don't know what it is. Can you look? That's moving from the world to words. You show, right? But maybe you're on the phone and you just describe. Then you and the doctor talk about what's going on. And then the doctor may issue a prescription, may say, oh, you need to come in, you need tests, whatever. All of those are actions outside of the words, right? So language exit moves take us from the words to the world. We'll be using this framework, so I think it will become clearer. So here's an example. That's actually my dog, Bowie. But let's say Mary says, my dog is in my backyard. When Mary says that, she issues these inference licenses, which come up in the middle of the framework of the language games. The specific inference licenses that go with my dog is in my backyard is that Mary has a dog, a backyard, the dog is in the yard, and so on. These are commitments. I hope you see that commitment gets us a little closer to the issue of trust. Licenses are transferable. The hearer can use them. And also, if they get challenged, they can defer the justification back to Mary. So, of course, they're challengeable. You can say, what dog? You have cats, which would be kind of playful. But then Mary can say, oh, no, I got a dog, and then introduce the dog or whatever, can respond. All of that, the licenses and the challenges are bound up with responsibilities. And that at the bottom, I put Brandam's comment in making it explicit. Inferring is a kind of doing. So all of the kinds of moral considerations, or many of them, are going to apply when we talk about our speech practices. So this is where my debt to Bob Brandam is enormous, because my approach to understanding language is based on a social practice and inferentialist model. Inferentialism takes the meaning of a word to be a matter of its use, specifically its place in a pattern of inferences we make. The view is developed for assertion and emphasizes what you can say next. So I say A, and from A you can infer B, so you can say B. And when someone says, why are you saying B? You say, because Lynne said A. And then they turn to me and say, why did you say that? In his first articulation of this view, Brandam said, the speech act of asserting arises in a particular socially instituted autonomous structure of responsibility and authority. In asserting a sentence, one both commits oneself to it and endorses it. Endorsement has to do with issuing licenses to others that authorize further assertions. Okay, scorekeeping is part of this picture. I don't use it later, but I just wanted to make note of it. And that's a place where Brandam is actually indebted to David Lewis. So that's a matter of keeping track. It's not so much about who's winning or losing, but keeping track of someone's commitments and the recipient's entitlements. Now, those commitments that others make can be part of your grounds for deciding whether you're going to trust them or not trust them. So when someone tells me I'm going to be talking about the shooting in my country in Buffalo, New York, and that just happened last week, and when if someone were to say something positive about that, my trust for them would diminish radically. So we can talk about that. So at the heart of this view is the concept of commitment. There's three kinds: identificatory. When Mary says, my dog is in my backyard, what dog? And this has a kind of reference-ish flavor to it. The assertional commitments are to what is said and require us to defend or justify the claim. I'm interested in expressive commitments, and those are to the viability and value of particular ways of talking. So when Romeo says of Juliet, Juliet is like the sun, or Juliet is the sun, he's using sun talk to talk about this woman of whom he's enamored. And so he actually extends that metaphor and makes the viability of it very clear. In a less friendly way, when the Hutu extremists in 1993 and 1994 called Tutsi cockroaches, and that practice took hold, they were making an expressive commitment to the viability and value of using cockroach talk to talk about human beings. That requires defense. I don't actually think it's defensible. And we have seen it not only there, but in many other places since. So when we look at these commitments, this is what I have at the bottom of the screen. We track the moves, those that are made and those that are still available. We issue and we use these commitments and licenses, and we look for new expressive commitments, codes, trigger words, salience factors. And sometimes what happens is we look at the expressive commitments, and that's a place where we say, oh yeah, this is someone who has a worldview that's very accurate and trustworthy. This shows trustworthiness, and sometimes the expressive commitments are a place where trustworthiness fails. In his work on trustworthiness, Russell Hardin says, and here I quote, from his early ethics paper. He says the central problems of effective cooperation are to commit oneself and to convince others that one is committed. Capacity for making and communicating a commitment is of much more general interest than merely for establishing trustworthiness, and we can approach the more specific problem from the more general. So I'm kind of going with that more general, looking at the commitments of speech acts and saying, what do we learn about trust from this? In Trust and Antitrust, Mcguire points out, trust is always an invitation not only to confidence tricksters, but also to terrorists who discern its most easily destroyed and socially vital forms. We inhabit a climate of trust, she adds, as we inhabit an atmosphere and notice it as we notice air, only when it becomes scarce or polluted. That's pretty dire, but it kind of it should help you see why I'm going to go on and talk about this event in a massacre in Buffalo, New York last week on May 17th, and also move on to talking about trust and terror. So this is not an exclusively American ideology. It actually comes from France originally, well, most prominently, but it has taken hold on the right wing in the USA. So on Saturday, May 14th, 2022, an 18-year-old white supremacist went on a rampage to kill Black people and shot 13 people, killing 10 at the Tops Market in Buffalo, New York. You may have read about this, but I'm assuming that many of you were busy working on your papers. I also don't assume America is the center of the world. So anyway, these were ordinary people doing ordinary things, like Andre McNeil picking up his 3-year-old son's birthday cake. The killer drove over 200 miles to his target, and according to his posted manifesto, was motivated by a commitment to prevent the great replacement of whites by people of color. This murderous spree not only resulted in immediate damage to the dead and injured and their families, it rocked the community and took away their one grocery store. Food insecurity is now a major issue in East Buffalo. The ripple effects will spread. These actions display a commitment to the ideology of white supremacy, and that ideology is transmitted by way of linguistic commitments. His manifesto, mostly cut and pasted from the internet, references the Great Replacement, a view most recently traced to the French novelist Renaud Camus, no relation to Albert. Camus posted that African migration to France, combined with their supposedly robust birth rates and declining birth rates of whites, will result in a white nation turning brown and whites being colonized by people of color. This is a view that motivates fear in insecure whites. This concept has gone viral in right-wing circles. Excuse me. The New York Times reports that Renaud Camus' longtime publisher dropped him for this view, as did many friends and acquaintances. They say, and here I quote, "But even as Mr. Camus became toxic, his phrase gained traction, first on French far-right websites," end quote. Politicians on the right and far right, including, oh, sorry, this is still in the quote. Politicians on the right and far right, including Ms. Le Pen, used the term. Other writers picked up the term, and it's favored, I'm adding, that's favored by many in the US Republican Party, who use it to foster fear in their followers. Okay, so one of the issues are these posted manifestos. The use of a code word, the Great Replacement, which has been in use in the US. The first time I heard it being used was being chanted in "You Will Not Replace Us" in Charlottesville in 2017. So next, some truth-telling from US President Joe Biden. I'm going to give two parts of his speech some analysis. Remember the question, who speaks, and to whom and why. So he starts off, Jill and I bring you this message from deep in our nation's soul. So he's making it a family message, not just a presidential message, but it is a presidential message with the authority of office, what Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. And he says, hate will not prevail, and white supremacy will not have the last word. For evil did come to Buffalo, and it's come to all too many places, manifested in gunmen who massacred innocent people in the name of hateful and perverse ideology rooted in fear and racism. I'm saying fear is the enemy of trust. Biden says what happened here is simple and straightforward. Terrorism. Terrorism. And then he adds domestic terrorism. This is something that the prior administration under Donald Trump refused to acknowledge existed. Biden adds, violence inflicted in the service of hate and a vicious thirst for power defines one group of people being inherently inferior to another group. I'm going to skip the next paragraph. It's about creating an us, them, other polarization. And then he goes on and says, I and all of you reject the lie. I call on all Americans to reject the lie. And I condemn those who spread the lie for power, political gain, and for profit. At this point, there was applause. And he says, because that's what it is. So where did that applause come from? It came from victims, survivors, and family members of victims. So Biden makes a direct statement that's descriptive, but he does it with normatively thick terms. He takes a stand and offers an ethical statement of resistance. Here I want to turn to Margaret Walker's wonderful book, Moral Repair, and her concept of normative abandonment. After Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi march there and the killing of Heather Heyer, Donald Trump said, there are good people on both sides. This is an unacceptable waffling from a head of state. In contrast, Joe Biden was in Buffalo trying to fight against the feelings of normative abandonment that the trauma surely induced. So let's listen to Walker for a minute. She says, if a community or authority to whom the victim looks for validation and vindication ignores the victim, challenges the victim's credibility, treats the victim's complaints as of little import, shelters or sides with the perpetrators of wrong, or worse, overtly or by implication blames the victim will feel abandoned and isolated. This abandonment is a second injury that can be humiliating. That second wound can also precipitate anger, grief, fear, terror, or despair, the same commonplace feelings that victims are liable to experience due to the original injury or wrong. That is because to fail to confirm the victim's sense of wrong is itself another wrong. It violates the morally essential trust that there are recognized shared rules by which we live and which we can count on to protect and guide us. Normative abandonment is especially painful, enraging, humiliating, and can feel disastrous for victims. So when Biden was in Buffalo trying to fight against feelings of normative abandonment that the trauma induced, he was fighting against the harms of white supremacy and ideology spread through internet manifestos and dark web chat rooms, and he was fighting these words with words. It's counterspeech. That's a concept that's more commonly used in philosophy of law and legal circles, but it's counterspeech that's specifically designed to restore the morally essential trust that there are recognized shared rules by which we live and which we can count on to protect and guide us. So let's see what he does next. He immediately after this said, white supremacy is a poison. It's a poison. It really is running through our body politic. It's been allowed to fester and grow right in front of our eyes. No more. I mean, no more. We need to say as clearly and forcefully as we can that the ideology of white supremacy has no place in America. None. Look, failure to saying that is going to be complicity. Silence is complicity. It's complicity. We cannot remain silent. Okay. The venom of the haters and their weapons of war, of violence, in the words and deeds of the, and pauses, that stalk our streets, our stores, our schools. This venom, this violence cannot be the story of our time. We cannot allow that to happen. So again, in the my color coding here, the red is the direct descriptive statement with morally thick terms. The green, no more, no more. I mean, no more. He's taking an ethical stance of resistance. And then the purple lines, we need to say as clearly and forcefully as we can, and that that white supremacy has no place in America, and that silence is complicity. This is kind of meta level statements about what we need to say. What would it be complicity in? And here's where, if we go back to entrance moves, words, and exit moves, it would be complicity in the exit moves, the violence that follows, logically and emotionally, from the venom of the toxic speech acts of white supremacy. That's a really strong statement from a public figure. We did not see this during the Trump administration. So I want to turn now to Karen Jones. One of my favorite papers by her called Trust and Basal Security, or Trust and Terror. And she's talking about basal security. She says the power of terror lies in its ability to shake what I call our basal security, an underlying affectively laden state that is explanatory of our willingness or otherwise to enter into particular three-place trusting relations. So this goes back to Mcguire saying that we inhabit a climate of trust. And what terror does is destroys the climate of trust. She says we only notice it. It's like the air we breathe, and we only notice it when it becomes scarce or polluted. That's what terrorism does. Now, Jones goes on to say this is about navigating risk. Low basal security requires us to navigate this risk. So she says it results in continuous or continual awareness of our own vulnerability, a practical orientation toward vulnerability and safety. And she says, and here I'm quoting her, practical or terrorists do not merely alter our perception of risk, making it more salient to us. They also alter our payoff matrices by adding subjective penalties to objective risk. In this way, they change the choices that it is rational for us to make. A well-designed terrorist campaign can thus be remarkably cost-effective as our own response to that terror magnifies its effects. We have seen this again and again in the 20th century. So I want to say something about discursive toxicity, toxins. I take this concept from medical and chemical toxicity and just apply it very directly. So toxicity is the degree to which a substance can harm humans or animals. Discursive toxicity is the degree to which a speech act or practice can harm humans or animals. That can be acute or chronic. A lot of our speech acts are a lot of our toxic speech acts are more chronic, The damage accrues over an extended period. There's a corrosion of our discursive practices and so on. Some examples of that are gaslighting, undermining, threats, etc. But sometimes there's something acute that creates an immediate rupture, and we can come back to that. The standard model of toxicity, and one that I developed in my first 2 papers, Toxic Speech and Antidotes and Inoculations, comes from Victor Klemperer in The Language of the Third Reich, and the idea of speech being like, he says, it's the language of the Third Reich was like tiny doses of arsenic that you take in unawares, and eventually the toxic effect sets in. That works, but sometimes the poison is more like polonium than like arsenic. So we'll see where this goes. Okay, so think of Joe Biden saying it's a poison, that it's a poison that is spread somehow from a poisoned well. So toxicity factors. I'm going to do this quickly because we don't need all the. So what is the toxin? And that's really the area that I want to focus on for thinking about the way that trust is undermined. At first, I thought the toxin was something like racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, xenophobia, and that's the list on the bottom of that section over here. But then I thought, it's not just those, they have something in common. And what they have in common is this area, the fear, disgust, contempt, wariness, distrust. There are questions that we can ask using this model. What was the dose of the fear or the disgust or the contempt or the wariness? How much distrust was generated? How ready was the other who hears it to give it uptake, to absorb it? How can we develop immunities to it? So these are some different questions that we can ask using this model. I'm really not going to develop that here, though we could in discussion. And my screen is not wanting to move. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to stop share, move the screen, and come back. Okay, so sorry about that. The poison well, that's one model, and it's a great model. But when you think about things like these viral transmissions across the internet of hate on 4chan, and the way that these manifestos from the killers get passed around, then what you see is a viral transmission instead of a poisoned well. So the poisoned well has a single source and people go to it. The viral transmission, there are multiple sources. There is variation in susceptibility. One of my graduate students sent me the Buffalo Killers manifesto. He actually had a hard time getting it, and then he had a hard time transmitting it. Google did not want him to email it to me. And I think that's a good thing, but it makes research harder. So am I susceptible to believing the hate in the manifesto. I don't believe so, but I do think that exposure increases risk. Variation is possible with transmission. So think about the children's telephone game. One person whispers something, the next one slightly varies it, and so on. We're seeing this going on right now with the coronavirus. It's varying and mutating. And the third point about, or the fourth point about viral transmission is that tracing can be difficult. That's becoming extremely difficult in the US right now because very few people are getting the PCR tests at the hospitals and instead are using home tests and not reporting. So we don't actually know how extensive the current outbreak is. We know it's pretty big. So this model is a different kind of model, and it raises questions about networks. So this takes me to the issue of echo chambers, which is about who to trust and why. Remember, I was asking earlier, how can someone who's an ordinary citizen, this is a question that motivated me in thinking about the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. How can ordinary people who are living on a hillside and being neighbors and friends and kind of taking care of each other turn against each other? Where does that come from? And with the background question is who to trust and why trust them. So some worrisome concepts: echo chambers from Tai Nguyen, closed-mindedness as developed by Heather, as explained by Heather Baddeley, and also her work on dogmatism, Baddeley's work on dogmatism. These raise worrisome issues about trust. So going to echo chambers and Tai Nguyen, he says an echo chamber is an epistemic structure created through the manipulation of trust. He later says it's an epistemic community which creates a significant disparity in trust between members and non-members. So entry is required. Remember, we have entry, the internal moves and exits. This disparity is created by excluding non-members through epistemic discrediting, while simultaneously amplifying members' epistemic credentials. Oh, so the members are more expert than non-members because they know. Finally, echo chambers are such that general agreement with some core set of beliefs is a prerequisite for membership. That's who gets in the game, where those core beliefs include beliefs that support that disparity in trust. So I want to say echo chambers are poisoned wells. If you're in an echo chamber, you are in the poisoned well. Remember Annette Mcguire, there are immoral as well as moral trust relationships, and moral trust busting can be a trust busting can be a morally proper goal. Breaking the grip of mutual trust in a white supremacist echo chamber is good trust busting. That's just a bare assertion by me. So now I turn to social psychologist Bill Mcguire, who was at Yale and is kind of considered the father of this question about how to persuade people to trust the messages of experts. So anyway, Mcguire has this model, which is, this is my picture of his model. And I want to focus on the top. He says, look, we have to think about when you try to figure out who can get across the message that teens should not smoke or smoke cigarettes or engage in risky sexual behaviors and so on. The first thing is to look at consider the source. And the source is credibility, attractiveness, power, and similarity. Those factors all take us right back to Pierre Bourdieu saying it's not just the message, which is the next part. It's not just what is said, it's who says it and whether we find them trustworthy. Credibility, attractiveness, power, and similarity are all factors in everyday trustworthiness. I'm not advocating that they should be, but I do think that they are. And that's part of where the entrance to these positive or negative language games comes about. Tribes have an impact here for the source, the message, and the perceiver. Okay, and what speaks is not the utterance alone, but the whole social person. Uh-oh, sorry. Are you seeing that subtitles are not currently available? I didn't mean to put that on. I'm not handling this well. Okay, so the nasty version of the language game. Observation sentences, low, and then throw in your least favorite slur. Low, there's one. That gives you a position in the game, identifying the target. It gets you from world to words. It also, part of the way, thinking about echo chambers and identity of speaker, using that slur is one of the ways that people signal to others that they're part of the echo chamber group. I had a neighbor who used a negative slur against African Americans with me, talking about some of the men who do work in the yard work in the neighborhood. And when I told her, this was down in North Carolina, and when I told her I didn't think that was an appropriate way to talk about African Americans, she said, well, you're a Yankee, so of course you think that. And this made the role of diction or word choice very clear to me, that it was also an identity test and a are you with me or not like me kind of test. So you use the slur, you get in the game, then the conspiracy theories are filled with inference licenses that carry people along with their identity quest. We can, and they instill fear and hate against others who are not part of that group. You can respond to that with challenges, and you can try to offer inoculations and antidotes. Those can all be within the word games. But the worry is that if those inoculations and antidotes don't take hold within the word-to-word world, that the actions within the game will change permissions outside the game, and we see shooter manifestos, which are the language moves, spread violence by way of licensing. And that's a really dire outcome. So speech for recognition and repair. This is necessary for restoring basal security, opening the door for trust. So Biden is a president with the authority of office. He's a father who has experienced grief of his son's death, and Americans know this about him. Who was he speaking to? Directly to the grieving. He went to their town. He didn't give a speech from the safety of the Oval Office. He went to their town, showing he knows who was killed by saying something positive about each individual. This is really sort of ground level speech acts that say, I see you, I recognize you, and I recognize what you have lost. To the nation, he's affirming values and reinforcing better norms. So toxic ideology, he's saying, is spread there's no place for that in America. I'm saying it's spread by toxic speech. When he says white supremacy is a poison, I think he's on board with my project. So the language exit moves are terrorist violence licensed by the ideology spread in the language moves. You might have thought that was an incomplete sentence, but it goes right down to the language moves. Those language moves actually depend on the language entry moves. Radicalization and identification of the other. So low immigrant or low slur. So how does Biden respond? He calls out the lie, and he calls it a lie. He condemns those who spread it. These are crucial speech acts to resist violence and avoid denial and complicity. So it's really important. Our discursive practices are not just about inculcating belief, but also about desire and affiliation. We can find this in Brandom, Langton, Jeshian, and others. Us-them polarization, for example, is rooted in the need to belong, and so is rooted in personality needs and social life. Language imbues all this, so what to do? Well, remember, Wittgenstein's saying language is a way of life, so we need to face and evaluate discursive practices that construct and shape our way of life. What are the things to be on the lookout for? Ideological grooming, attempts to impose or inculcate particular ideologies. Ask, are you in an echo chamber? How do you apportion epistemic trust? How do you apportion recommendation trust? That's a concept from Bennett. Average everyday practices that go unnoticed or may even be welcomed need to be examined. And finally, we need to speak out against discursive violence in all its forms. Sometimes more creative action has to happen in the arenas in which the white supremacists are operating. So I include here reference to the anonymous hack of Epic, which was a database holding all the information about the identities of the owners of the major websites that were promoting hate and inciting violence. Many of these folks were leading double lives, differently trusted in their local towns. Nice guy, trustworthy, versus trusted on the hate site. Oh, he hates just like I do, I trust him. So they were getting trust in two different arenas by not being honest in either one. So Aubrey Caudill says, everyone is tired of hate. There just hasn't been enough pushback. And these far-right players, they play dirty. Nothing is out of bounds for them. And now the tide is turning and there's a swell moving back in their direction. Finally, what does it matter if our speech practices abandon truth, license violence, instill fear, and undermine trust? Discursive practices are crucial for our functional capabilities, our capacities as rational, autonomous, and well-related beings. That means our capacity to trust. We are social, so it matters what is said to and about us. Little shout out there to Lagonis and Spellman and Have We Got a Theory for You? Wonderful paper from the early days of second wave feminism. Our physical well-being. Discursive practices are crucial to our physical well-being and our very health. We're made of flesh and blood and bones, but also made of words and norms and practices, hopes and expectations. When this gets damaged, we carry an extra heavy allostatic load, and talk to any physician about the damage that that allostatic load does. It's a lot of stress to carry. So how harms to the self that's made of words and ideas, social relations, family histories, life plans, narratives, and so on? I'm concerned with how harms to this phenomenal being can result in harms to our bodies, sometimes life-threatening harms. But I'm also concerned with how damages to individuals can become damage to the social and political body. That is, how these kinds of damages destroy our capacity for social and political trust. Thank you. Oops, we don't want that.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Very interesting and deep analysis of discursive practices and a painful aspect of current culture that we all have to live with. If I could just start off with one, it's more, I guess, would be an empirical observation point that would be good to have your reaction to. This discursive practice of resistance and calling it what it is and fighting it, that also leads to more polarization, right? And that's kind of almost like we have to be prepared for warfare. And in social media, it's easy to hide behind anonymous kind of facades. And so what is interesting about Epic, I guess, the anonymous side, is that it's making it really cost people who are spreading hateful, messages. And what else can we say about that increasing cost of making life less tolerable for certain groups? Anything else that we can kind of think about? I don't know if that was too broad, or maybe another talk, but
Honestly, so there are two different kinds of models here. One is a battle of the words that is a battle of ideologies in which goes the way that you just described, right? But there is another way which has to do with breaking open the echo chamber and making it that people are strong enough who are outside the echo chamber that they don't get sucked in. And there, I think something like Jason Stanley's concept of propaganda versus civic rhetoric might be useful, where the propaganda is about bypassing rationality and feeding the psycho-emotional needs of the individuals, whereas the civic rhetoric engages rationality. I'm oversimplifying, but I think if we made people stronger and we engaged more in civil rhetoric and less in propaganda, then when people come at us with propaganda, we may have the cognitive and emotional tools to be able to say, I see what you're doing and it isn't working on me. And the more we can do that, eventually, I think the hate groups will die back. So I'm suggesting a strategy for sucking the oxygen out of their echo chamber.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
I'm trying to suffocate.
Yeah, yes. There's microphones available for questions. So there's a question up there. Introduce yourself also, and Lynn will not be able to see you. So, go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Tirrell. I'm Dr. Teresa Branch-Smith. I'm a postdoc at the University of Connecticut. And my question is about the influence of social media on promoting the popularity of terror. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the linguistic power or how to categorize speech acts such as reposting or liking in climates of terror, since many people use the like repost as an excuse to say, I'm not endorsing it per se, I'm just putting it out there, DYOR, do your own research.
I'm not sure I heard everything, even though there was a microphone. So you're concerned about
when someone reblogs or reposts something on social media.
Okay.
And they don't necessarily say that they endorse it, that's the defense that tends to come up, but rather they say they're just putting it out there and letting you, the reader, decide. How does that get categorized in terms of the framework for speech acts and commitments to speech acts that you've outlined here in this talk.
Okay, thank you. I think I got it. And on my view, that would just count as irresponsible speech. So this is someone who is trying to assert without making a commitment. And you don't get to do that. Now, they say, I'm not asserting. And let's consider different scenarios. So I did not name the Buffalo shooter. I chose not to do that. I also didn't name the victims, but that's because it wasn't directly relevant for our topic right now, but Joe Biden did. Okay, so let's go back and think. When you analyze, so as an academic, when you analyze something, right? Sometimes you have to put it out there and say, look, this is what, so suppose I wrote a chapter analyzing the killer's manifesto, excuse me, which would actually be analyzing a lot of different fragments from the echo chamber in which he lives. And I say, I don't endorse these, I'm just putting them out there. Yeah, but putting them out there has the power to license others to use them. And so there is not a way to repeat without also licensing. And when you do that, you have committed to it, which is really challenging for a scholar. So in the early days, if you were to go look up a paper that I wrote in the 90s, I wrote it in 1992, and it's on derogatory terms. And I tried to be really careful about not using, it's about 2 different derogatory terms. And I tried to be really careful about not using them or not repeating them very often. But I found I needed to at various times. And now when I go back and I look at it, I cringe at times. I like the analysis, right, in general, but I cringe at how often the terms appear. And because since that time, and I think Ray Langton is the first to use the term leaky. And she says, some of these terms are leaky. So even though I don't endorse it, the endorsement kind of leaks out. And so even if I say I don't endorse it, I'm putting it out there. And that is undertaking at least some kind of commitment to it. And it can be that I try in every way to distance myself from it, but I've given it extra oxygen. I've given it extra life. And I wish there were a way to study something like this and not give it extra life, because we can't simply ignore it. So anyway, back to my main answer is, if someone talks about it in a blog and they say, I don't endorse what I just wrote, I'm just putting it out there, I say, you're being really irresponsible. I hope that helped.
Thank you. She's saying, of course. Any other questions, anyone? Well, yeah, Maria, yes. By the way, if I could just comment on the last thing you said, Lynn, your metaphor of toxicology may also be useful here, because, you know, if you put things like toxins out there and, you know, harmful elements out there for too long or in a certain way, it will harm people. But as a scientist, you need to study that harmful element for you to be able to, reduce its harmfulness or to manage it. So that's kind of finding the balance of not to harm others while you're trying to figure out how to immobilize it, if you will.
Can I say one quick thing about that? Which is also that sometimes toxins play a positive role in medicine, like chemotherapy, right? And so chemotherapy is toxic, but you want it to be toxic enough to kill the cancer and but not so toxic as to kill the individual. And so, alcohol is a toxin, and yet people voluntarily imbibe it all the time. And that's because they think they can control the toxin. So toxins, it gets very complicated. So thank you for that, Alan.
Sure. Maria, yes.
Hi, Lynne, Maria Bagramian here. Sorry you
Hi,
couldn't be with us, but next time we'll definitely make it a date to come together to Armenia. So you and I grew up in that traditional philosophy of language where truth is seen as central to meaning and to speech acts, whichever version you take, Davidson, Austin, Grice, you name it, they all made truth central to discourse, to meaning. Now, what happened in the last 4 years during Trump's presidency and before that, we saw a completely different way of approaching language, which the issue was not lies or truths, but just distortion, complete distortion. And your analysis goes back in many ways, not fully, but in many ways to this other model of language where truth does matter. But how do you counter those who use language without respect for truth at all?
That's a really good question. I think that we, I think one of the really hard things about Donald Trump as a speaker, we won't even have to go into all of the horrors of his other behavior, but as a speaker, was that he didn't even care about using subjects and predicates. And I want to start with that, because if you don't have a subject and a predicate, what are you saying? Right. Now, there may be languages, I think there are a couple of where that doesn't operate the same way, but in English and most of the world languages, you need subjects and predicates. He spoke in fragments, and the reason he spoke in fragments, maybe that had something to do with whatever's going on with his brain, but I actually think there was a political motive to that, which is to make himself a Rorschach blot so that people read onto his meandering blathering what they wanted to hear. And so it was also a way to avoid commitment and to claim commitment when things went well. But in general, he was avoiding commitment as much as possible. And so, commitment and truth go hand in hand. Although you can be committed to a lie, but but in general, when you undertake a commitment, you're undertaking the truth of what you're saying. And so I actually think that this is this mode of public pronouncement was not only damaging to truth, I think it was very damaging to democracy, to democratic deliberation, and to social trust. So when if someone tells me that they are a strong supporter of Donald Trump, I ask them why. And then they tell me what they think of him. And I say, where did you get that? And then I start to realize it's not so much whatever Donald Trump said or did, it's them. And so it's what I find is that they haven't given up on truth. And they just attribute their truth to his nonsensical meandering. I don't know if that's helpful. So, and the thing that's interesting is Brandom, in the early days of writing, making it explicit, was against truth and against reference. And he wanted to kind of create workarounds with it, but never was he against commitment. And so,
yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I believe we're already over time, but if there's one more question, because this is the last talk of the day. Everyone wants to say something, but
Can I ask a question or
Yes.
does that not work? Does that work?
Yes, oh, yes, of
Can you-
course. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
please.
excellent.
Sorry, I
Thanks so
forgot
much.
the, online
Yes.
audience, sorry about that.
I
But,
know. Thanks so much for a very interesting talk. I think it's a great idea to connect these issues with toxic speech to trust issues. But I was wondering what you said about echo chambers, that there are poison wells. I mean, of course, it depends on how you characterize them, but the standard view is that there are these relations of trust and distrust, and that they are necessary. I mean, we all live in echo chambers because that's how we get information from other people. So I wouldn't think that the thing to do is sort of get out of your echo chamber. You would get no knowledge, but rather to make sure that your trust is well placed and your distrust is well placed.
I would agree with you about the last part of what you said. But the problem with echo chambers is that that action, I don't think we all live in echo chambers. I think the action of discrediting people on the basis of group identity is characteristic of what Nguyen calls the echo chamber. And so if I say, well, I can't believe Asa because she's from Sweden. So, that would just be ridiculous. It would be ridiculous. And if you say, I can't believe Lynne Tirrell because she's from the USA and they murder their children there. Not everybody does that. And we do have these terrible problems that are heinous, but that doesn't undermine the capacity to believe each other, right? So it's the going through group identity in order to let people into your echo chamber that creates the I only am going to hear what I want to hear group feedback loop. And that's a problem. So we have a problem with that, not just in the US, but in parts of Europe as well, where people are not talking across ideological divides. But it's not everyone, not everywhere. And so one of the ways you get out of the echo chamber is to, for me, since I am not a fan of Donald Trump, I find him despicable. If someone tells me they're a Trumpy, to say, why do you support him, right? And they're not going to say I'm a Trumpy. They're going to say, I wish Donald Trump were still president. And I say, why would you want that? And then start the conversation. And if you do that, then you're not in the echo chamber anymore.
Well, it depends on your trust, right? But anyhow, it depends on how you define these echo chambers. And they are different from epistemic bubbles. That's a different thing, which is
Right.
much more problematic. But thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question.
Yes, I'm sensitized. I'm looking at the online participants also. There are no questions there. Should we wrap this up? Going once, going twice? Thank you very much, Lynne.